My name is Claire Whitman, and for most of my adult life, I was the family failure. The one who walked away from everything they expected. I didn't stay in our little town of Briar Glen. I didn't join the family bank. I didn't marry a local boy or settle down 2 blocks from my parents. I left with a suitcase and a sketchbook, chasing something none of them believed in, and every time I came back for a holiday, or tried to, they reminded me of what I supposedly gave up. My father called me foolish. My brother said I'd grow out of it. My mother? She just looked at me like I was someone else's daughter. But today, on a warm spring afternoon, I stood on the steps of a building I had designed, funded, and fought to create. The new Briar Glen Community Center. The same town that once called me a dreamer, now filled the courtyard, clapping. And when the mayor pulled me in for a hug and said into the microphone, "She rebuilt this town," the world around me fell silent. I looked down at my family in the front row. They didn't cheer, they didn't smile. They just stared, like they didn't know who I was anymore. And maybe, finally, they didn't. Because I wasn't the girl who left in shame anymore. I was the woman who came back and proved them all wrong without ever needing to say a word. I was 22 the last time I stood in my parents' kitchen. My acceptance letter to the School of Architecture at NYU was crumpled in my hand, my father's voice shaking the walls more than the summer thunderstorm outside. "This is nonsense," he said, slamming his whiskey glass on the counter. "You think you're going to draw buildings and save the world? Grow up, Claire. That's not a career, that's a phase." I remember my brother Nathan leaning against the fridge, arms crossed, wearing that smug grin he always reserved for me. "You'll be back," he said, "when your rent's overdue and your dreams run out." I looked to my mother, silently begging her to say something, to soften the blow. But she just folded a dish towel, her eyes fixed on the corner of the counter, like it was safer than looking at me. I had always known I was different. While Nathan followed the plan, business school, internship at Dad's bank, a safe condo 2 miles from home, I spent weekends sketching abandoned buildings on the edge of town, dreaming of what they could become. I loved structure, but I loved possibility more. I wanted to make spaces that mattered, that breathed, but no one in my family ever asked why. So I left. No dramatic exit, no door slamming. Just a quiet ride to the train station with my best friend Erin, who hugged me so tightly I nearly broke. She said, "Don't look back unless you want to go back." And I didn't. Not really. New York was colder than I expected, and louder, and lonelier. My apartment was a glorified shoebox, and I worked nights at a bakery to afford it. By day, I studied, furiously, hoping to prove that I belonged in rooms that people like my father had told me weren't made for girls like me. The holidays were the worst. Thanksgiving passed without a call. I sent a Christmas card and got nothing back. On my birthday, I checked my phone every 5 minutes, waiting for something. Anything. Silence. And yet, I stayed. I told myself that maybe they'd come around once I had something real to show. A license, a job, something that proved I hadn't wasted my life. But even after graduation, even after I got hired by one of the city's mid-size firms, the silence continued. One time, I ran into Nathan at a conference in Chicago. He was speaking on a panel about regional banking strategies. I approached him afterward, cautiously hopeful. He gave me a nod, like he barely recognized me, and said, "Still chasing your little buildings, huh?" That's when I stopped hoping. Instead, I started building. Not just structures, but something sturdier than approval. I built a life, a network, a reputation. By 30, I had left the firm and opened my own small consultancy, focused on community redevelopment, breathing life into forgotten neighborhoods. But that took years. And in those years, I grieved the family I thought I had. I let go of the version of myself who needed their applause. Still, on quiet nights, I'd wonder, if I ever did something big enough, would they see me? Would it matter? I didn't know then that the answer was on its way. It would start with a phone call from someone I hadn't spoken to in over a decade, a voice from Briar Glen asking if I'd ever consider coming home. Not to visit, not for a holiday, but for something bigger, something broken that needed fixing. And for the first time since I left, I hesitated. Not because I didn't care, but because I wasn't sure I owed them anything anymore. New York didn't wait for anyone to catch up. It moved fast, like it knew you didn't belong, and for a long time, I didn't. The first few months were brutal. I was juggling morning lectures, part-time shifts at the bakery, and late nights in the studio working on design projects that pushed me to the edge of exhaustion. There were nights I came home with flour in my hair and graphite on my cheeks, collapsing onto a futon that creaked louder than the subway outside my window. There were no calls from home, no birthday texts, not even a forwarded chain email from Mom. I tried for a while to reach out. I sent them pictures of my first apartment, a video tour of my final project sophomore year, a letter after I got my internship with Grayson plus Hale, a boutique firm known for adaptive reuse. No response, not even a seen notification. Eventually, I stopped trying. Instead, I poured myself into the work. I became obsessed with old buildings, abandoned libraries, crumbling tenements, forgotten churches. I saw beauty in what others called decay. It wasn't about nostalgia. It was about possibility. I wanted to rebuild what people had given up on. But the industry wasn't welcoming at first. I wasn't from the Ivy League. I didn't have connections. I once showed a portfolio to a senior partner at a networking event, and he barely glanced at it before saying, "Pretty lines." But where's the market viability? I smiled, nodded, then cried in the bathroom for 20 minutes. There were moments, real moments, when I almost gave up. Nights I stared at my ceiling and thought about packing it all in. Going back to Briar Glen, getting some basic office job, moving into the guest room, pretending none of this had happened. But then I'd remember the look in my father's eyes when he told me I'd never make it, that smirk on Nathan's face, that invisible silence from my mother. And suddenly, quitting felt worse than failing. So I stayed. I got better. My designs grew bolder, more intentional. I learned how to pitch not just beauty, but utility. Not just dreams, but deliverables. I worked my way up from assistant to junior architect, then project manager, then lead. I made friends, real ones, who cheered for my wins and held me up through losses. By the time I turned 30, I had saved enough to launch my own firm. Whitman Rebuilds. It started small, just me, an assistant, and a shared workspace in Brooklyn. But we had vision. We took on the jobs nobody else wanted. The vacant warehouse in Newark. The burned-out rec center in Trenton. We didn't just design. We partnered with city councils, local nonprofits, and businesses to fund, staff, and launch spaces that meant something. The day I cut the ribbon on the refurbished Unity Arts Center, a place where kids in the Bronx could take free music and design classes, I looked around and thought, this is what I left home for. And yet, even then, my phone stayed silent. My parents never asked. My brother never checked. They didn't know what I was building, and I told myself I didn't care. Until the night Erin, my best friend, said something that stuck. We were drinking wine on her rooftop, watching the lights blur into the skyline. "You know," she said, "I think deep down, you're still waiting for them to be proud." I wanted to argue. I wanted to say I didn't need that. But the lump in my throat said otherwise. I laughed it off, but she wasn't wrong. Some part of me still held on to the impossible hope that one day I'd do something so big, so undeniable, they'd have no choice but to see me. And then, months later, it happened. A call. From a 312 number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't pick up. "Claire Whitman," a man's voice said. "This is Councilman Reed. I represent Briar Glen. I got your name from someone in Chicago who worked with your firm. We could really use your help." I didn't speak. I wasn't sure I could. He continued, "Our town's in trouble. The old mill shut down. People are leaving. Businesses, too. We're trying to rebuild, but we don't have the vision or the trust. Someone said you specialize in places people forget." I swallowed hard. He wasn't calling because of my family. He was calling because of me. And for the first time in a long time, the idea of going home didn't make me flinch. It made me wonder what I could do, if I had the courage to try. I didn't say yes right away. After the councilman's call, I sat in my office staring at the sticky note where I'd scribbled his number, Briar Glen. The name felt like a bruise I hadn't touched in years. A town frozen in memory. Front porches, 4th of July parades, the smell of wet pavement in August. But also, judgment, silence, the suffocating weight of never being enough. I called Erin. "Do you think I'd be crazy to go back?" I asked her. There was a long pause, then her voice, soft but firm. "I think you'd be crazy not to." So I flew back, first time in over a decade. The airport was smaller than I remembered. Everything was. The streets were quieter, the storefronts older, more faded. Even the gas station looked tired. Councilman Reed met me at the diner. He was younger than I expected, maybe mid-40s, with worry behind his eyes and coffee stains on his sleeve. "It's not just the factory," he said. "We've lost 3 small businesses this year. The school's cutting art. The pharmacy shut down last month. We need something. Anything." I asked about funding, zoning, community sentiment. He said people were skeptical, burned too many times by big promises, but when I laid out a rough plan, repurposed the factory into a multi-use hub with housing, education space, and a local market, his eyes lit up. "We need hope," he said, barely above a whisper, "and we need someone who knows what this place could be." I nodded, not because I was sure, but because I saw what he meant. I had spent years rebuilding broken things. Maybe it was time I rebuilt the place that broke me. Still, I hadn't told my family. Not yet. That would come later, and not the way I imagined. I didn't tell them I was coming. I wasn't sure they'd care. But word travels fast in small towns. By the time I showed up at the town hall with my design board and community grant paperwork, people were already whispering, "Claire Whitman! That Claire!" It was like returning as both a ghost and a rumor. When I finally saw my parents again, it wasn't planned. I was walking out of the hardware store, arms full of blueprints, when I heard my name. My mother stood there in front of me, holding a bag of tomatoes like it was a shield. Her eyes scanned me from head to toe, confused, cautious, and maybe something else. "Claire," she said, like testing the word. "You're back." I nodded. "For work." She opened her mouth, then closed it. "Your father didn't know." I figured. We stood in silence on the sidewalk, the space between us full of everything she hadn't said in years. She didn't invite me over. I didn't ask. The next time I saw my father was worse. He came to a town council meeting, only because Nathan was invited to speak as a local business leader. When I took the floor to explain my vision for the old factory, my father didn't look at my slides. He looked straight through me. Afterwards, I passed him in the hallway. "You've got some nerve," he muttered. "Waltzing in here like you matter." I didn't respond. Not because I was scared, because I wasn't. Not anymore. Instead, I threw myself into the work. I met with teachers, small business owners, laid out budgets, filed permit after permit. I worked with young contractors, retired builders, even a few skeptics who started showing up just to argue, until they started helping. Somewhere along the way, people stopped calling me the one who left and started calling me the one who's trying. And that mattered more than I expected, because I wasn't rebuilding this town with concrete and metal. I was rebuilding trust, rebuilding us. The day of the grand opening felt unreal. Briar Glen hadn't seen a crowd like that in years. The newly repurposed building stood proud in the center of town. The old factory, once rusted and silent, now alive with color, light, and people. Flags lined the sidewalk. Kids held handmade signs. Reporters clustered near the steps. And there I was, standing behind the podium, my heart hammering in my chest. I had rehearsed my speech 100 times, but in that moment, words felt small compared to the journey behind them. So I spoke simply, about what it meant to lose faith in a place, and then choose to fight for it anyway. I looked out into the crowd and saw faces that had once been skeptical, now smiling. I saw Erin, flown in from New York, standing near the front, tears in her eyes. And then I saw them, my family, sitting in the front row, silent. My father's arms were crossed tight over his chest, his jaw clenched like stone. My mother sat beside him, hands folded, lips pressed thin. Nathan scrolled his phone, like none of this mattered. But they were there. Not because I'd asked them to be, but because they couldn't not be. Then the mayor stepped forward. Mayor Albright was a tall man with a voice that carried. He didn't just speak, he declared. He shook my hand, leaned into the microphone, and said, "This town was on the edge. We were losing hope. But one of our own came back, not to relive the past, but to reimagine our future." He turned to the audience. "She rebuilt this town, with vision, with grit, with heart." Then he pulled me in for a hug, broad, public, undeniable, and the crowd roared. I couldn't see my father's face anymore, but I didn't need to, because that hug, that sentence, that moment, it wasn't just for me, it was proof. Proof that the girl they once called naive had become the woman who gave their town a second chance, and they had to watch it happen, with nothing to say. After the ceremony, people lined up to thank me, shaking my hand, hugging me, even handing me homemade jam and hand-stitched thank you notes. The local paper snapped a photo of me beside the mayor, smiling under the new sign, the Whitman Center for Community Growth. It wasn't my idea to name it after me. That came from the council. But I didn't argue, because for the first time in my life, my name meant something here. As the sun dipped below the rooftops and the crowd thinned, I caught one last glimpse of my parents getting into their car. My father didn't look back. Nathan slammed his door a little too hard. But my mother? She paused, met my eyes, and for the briefest second, just a flicker, she nodded. It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest thing to acknowledgment I'd ever gotten from her. And maybe, just maybe, it was enough. I stayed in Briar Glen longer than I planned, not because I had unfinished business, but because I wanted to walk the streets one more time. Not as the daughter who left, but as the woman who had finally come home on her own terms. Every day, I passed the community center and watched it bloom. Seniors were teaching painting in the old break room. A single dad opened a bike repair station near the back loading dock. Kids were laughing in places that had once echoed with rust and silence. Even the garden, just a handful of raised beds and native flowers, buzzed with life. And something in me softened. I was sitting alone in the main hall one evening, reviewing grant applications, when I heard a knock on the front door. It was my mother. She looked soaked from the rain, unsure of what to say. She didn't come with grand words or apologies, just a small envelope held with both hands, like it meant more than anything she'd ever spoken aloud. Inside was a photograph. Me at 22, standing on the edge of the train platform, facing forward, not looking back. My face held the ache of someone choosing herself for the first time. On the back, in her cursive, she left in silence. She returned with strength. She looked at me and said quietly, "I didn't know how to love the girl you were becoming. But I see her now, and I'm proud of the woman she grew into. She didn't try to explain away the years. She didn't ask for mine back, and somehow that made all the difference. We didn't hug. We just stood there, letting the stillness between us say what words never could." The next morning, I packed up my car and drove out of town. No rearview mirror glances, no sadness, just a quiet, full peace. They once said I failed, that I'd come crawling back, that I'd learn my place. But the truth? I found my place. I built it, with vision, with grit, with love. And now, long after their doubts have faded, they sit inside a world I imagined, one they could never dream of, but now cannot live without. I didn't just rebuild a town, I rebuilt myself, and that was always enough.